Everyone. Today, we're going to be talking about the origin of humanity. I mean, what a huge topic. But before we do, just take a moment, just get present within yourself, take a few deep breaths, and get a notebook because I really want you to take some notes here. This is some good stuff. So, there's so much written about the origin of humanity. There are so many stories from so many different cultures. I'm going to be focusing on the Bible and Christianity and looking at Genesis and what the story is there, and then, just adding my perspective. So, everything I talk about today is my perspective, maybe some of my theories. I'm not saying with any, veracity that, hey, this is the way it was. These are just some theories that I have based on some personal experience, some things that I've read and researched, and, a little bit of everything. So, let's get started. First off, if we look, of course, the first five books of the Bible in the Old Testament was written in Hebrew, right? We know the New Testament was written in Greek and very different languages with very different nuances. So it's important to keep that in mind. Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Now, the Hebrew word for God here used was Elohim, and I think a lot of us know by now that that is a plural use of the word God. Now, interestingly enough, the verb tense was singular. So even though the word for God that was used was Elohim, it was a singular verb, making it sound like it was one God who created the heaven and the earth. And there are different interpretations for the word Elohim. Some scholars believe that it can just mean almighty, powerful one. But I know sometimes we go, well, in other places of the Bible, it talks about multiple gods as well. So, we keep that in mind. We take that with a grain. In Genesis 1:26, and God said, let us make man in our image after our likeness. Now, prior to that, the other verses in between, God is, creating the stars, the day and the night, and the beasts of the field, all of that. And then he gets to man and he says, let us make man in our image after our likeness. And then further down, it does say, so God then, created man. It sounds like it goes back to the singular. But what's really interesting, and some scholars say, it doesn't specifically say that God created man at this point out of thin air. What it says is, let's create man in our image, or let us make man in our image. So some people say, well, maybe man already existed and God is refashioning man into more like his image. I think that's a distinct possibility. Do I think that's absolutely true? I don't know, but I think it's a distinct possibility. Uh, and then in verse 28, he says, be fruitful, multiply, and replenish the earth. And that is a key there, replenish. And so it makes us go, does this mean that, things were wiped out and we're starting over and we have to replenish? There were humans before and, they were wiped out. It's entirely possible, right? Because what do we know? We know that when the floods came, Noah, took his family and two of every animal, that's the story. And for 40 days, 40 nights, went through the rain and everything was wiped out, and then they had to go replenish the earth, right? And so this is what makes it so fascinating. And this is what leads me to believe that this is the same old story of creation, destruction, right? And maybe each time that God creates the earth, maybe it's a little bit better, or maybe it's a little more, maybe it's an upgrade. I don't know. But I think it's really fascinating to look at it from this perspective. Now, 2 Peter 3:6, whereby the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished. Again, talking about the floods. And so here comes a new earth or a new version of earth, right? And if we take a look at archaeology, what is archaeology? It's digging for artifacts, right? For ancient civilizations, for, bones, for all the things. But they're digging. And so they're finding these things underground. And what comes to mind for me is, if we're in some kind of a simulation, that it's like a game of Minecraft, right? Somebody's building, wiping away and starting over, or building on top, wiping, destroying it and just building a new civilization on top of the old one. And that to me is kind of where the sci-fi AI comes in. It's like, well, we have some text, we have some history, but it seems like there's always a big fire and a library's burnt, or all of these scrolls and texts get lost. And somehow, sometimes they show up later, like the Nag Hammadi text, right? But we know the Vatican has all kinds of archives, but we don't know what they have because they don't share that. But if everything is wiped out and then we start over, we don't really have the memory of that. We don't have the understanding. And so we're like thinking, hey, we're the first civilization that had running water or that had electricity. But recently I was watching, I think it was a Greg Braden podcast where he talks about in Pakistan, finding researchers found a civilization that did have running hot and cold water and electricity and all of these different things. And it was quite an advanced civilization. And what they found in the artifacts was that things were melted almost like with radiation because there were some radioactive skulls and artifacts in this area that they dug up basically. So there's so much more to civilization than we know. We have a fraction of the picture. And, I think a lot more people are getting on board with like, oh, looking at these ancient civilizations like Tartaria and Atlantis and going, wow, these were ancient or advanced civilizations. But, we're taught to think that, oh no, we're the most advanced we've ever been, even though there's a period of the Dark Ages where there's no recounting of nearly anything. And it's like, okay, yeah, everything stayed the same for this amount of time. I don't know. That that gives me cause for pause. However, looking at this and then Revelation 21:1, and I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. Again, here we have this revelation, we have this prophecy. Why is it a prophecy? In my humble opinion, it's because it's probably happened before numerous times. And I think the Bible has a lot of symbology that we haven't been able to put context to because we were only, we're here in our civilization now, not understanding that there could have been some high-tech stuff back in the day, right? And so when we look at like the story of Ezekiel when he's taken up, when I read through that, it's like, wow, it sounds to me like he's taken up in a spaceship. But we wouldn't have been able to articulate that throughout the years, throughout the centuries. Maybe, here now in the 21st century, we can articulate that because we see UFOs and we have advanced aircraft and so forth. But back in his time, and he was so blown away, he didn't even speak for it. Was it a week? Something like that. But when I read through, I'm like, wow, yeah, these, burning, turning wheels, it sounds like a spaceship. And I think that's where Christianity really falls short. We don't allow for new interpretations based on fresh sets of eyes and new information and the technology that we have and so forth. We just don't allow for it. And so we have these very narrow viewpoints of the stories in the Bible and, how everything is coming to pass and what we think of God and what we think of, the story between good and evil and all of that. We are so stunted, I think, in our viewpoints because we haven't been able to articulate. And so I like to have a really open mind when it comes to these stories, and I like to read them through a spiritual lens and also through a tech lens, if that makes sense. Now, I want to take a minute and talk about the Garden of Eden. Speaking of tech, I think it's very possible that Earth was hijacked in the Garden of Eden. And I think that's when the realm was distorted. So we know the story. God created male and female, right? And and he created the earth and all the plants and all the flora and the fauna and the creatures and the beasts, right? And then he says, "Man, you're going to be in charge of all of this." Because think about it. What would be the point of having an earth that didn't have humans? Might get boring after a while. And, I'm going to say this out loud, but humans could very well be a commodity, right? I'm going to create this world and I'm going to, put humans on this planet. For what? For what? Now, I don't know if when you were a kid you had an ant farm. Those are kind of fascinating. I never had one, but I've seen them, and I always was fascinated watching all the ants and what they're doing, and could watch for hours. And that's kind of what the Greeks thought, with all the Greek gods on Mount Olympus, watching the people interfering. You know, I don't know, but I think it's possible to look at the fact that humans are here, and we need to ask ourselves why. Why? And in the garden, so we have Adam and Eve, and they're prototypes, right? And that's why God has to specifically put them in a containment, right? So they're not the first people, and it's very clear in the Bible. They're not the first people, but they're the first prototype, right? Of whatever God's creating. Now, is he doing this in a petri dish? Is he, are they messing with DNA? I think it's very possible. I think it's very possible. But Adam and Eve are in the garden. They don't have a knowledge of good and evil. And maybe again, because they're a prototype. And, were they created as adults? Were they created as children? It doesn't say anything about that. It just says Adam and Eve, right? So we just assume they're created as adults. Did they have any kind of education? Who taught them how to speak? We don't ever talk about that. We don't ever even wonder about it. It's like we're not allowed. So they're created, it sounds to me like vegans, right? You can eat of the fruit. I think it says it's supposed to be your meat. Makes sense. Okay, so they're vegan. And the serpent, whoever that is. Now, when we talk about the word serpent, we're not talking about a snake because that comes later, right? God curses the serpent. So it makes sense that the serpent is walking upright, right? And comes and talks to Adam and Eve, or Eve first specifically, and tempts her to eat the fruit. Now, a lot of people say that they think the fruit is symbolic. I'm going to tell you this. I don't think the fruit is symbolic. I think it was an actual piece of fruit, and I'll tell you why in a minute. So she eats the fruit, and then somehow or another, it's not necessarily that just her eating the fruit caused a huge fall, although it's possible. I think what happened was the fruit contained a code, a specific code, and somehow or another, the enemy got the code out of Eve. So, when God finds out, they ate the fruit, the one thing that he says is, I will put enmity between your seed and his seed, the serpent's seed. And you have to figure out like, or ask why. Why would there need to be enmity? Not sure. But I think the fruit was a code. And when the enemy got the code for God's creation, think of it in AI terms, okay? Think of it in tech terms. Then he was able to corrupt the code and the program. And so then that's why God says, okay, well, now you're going to have pain in childbirth. You're going to have to toil and suffer, basically, because the code where Adam and Eve lived, the the program in which they lived in became corrupt. And they weren't able to sustain the frequency needed to live in a higher dimension. So God had to ask them to leave the garden. Now they're a threat because now we don't want them to eat out of the other tree, the tree of life, and live forever, right? So they're only allowed certain things for certain reasons, and we don't know all the reasons. But when I think about what happened, so they're living in a paradise, right? No suffering, everything's happy, they don't know what they don't know, kind of thing. But then after the fall, well, and by the way, God gave the earth, he gave dominion of the earth to Adam and Eve. And what do we know about the heavens is there's a lot of legalities, right? There's a lot of contracts and a lot of covenants and all of this. And so I think it's possible that Eve, somehow the enemy was able to usurp ownership of earth from Adam and Eve. And again, these are my theories, so just stick with me. Could be wrong. But it became distorted. So in this distorted matrix, we've become a vampiric realm. And the reason I say that is because now we have to exist on the energy of other things and creatures, and we eat animals. Now, you could argue that it's a good thing we eat animals, it's a bad thing, it just depends on who you are, what your belief system is. I personally feel like in a more restored realm, we would never eat another living creature. And I'll tell you, oh my gosh, this was so interesting. Side story. Earlier this summer, I went to a cattleman's ball. Somebody gave me a ticket, and I was like, sure, I'll go. And it was a fundraiser for cancer research, but there was a big booklet that they gave everyone, and you're going through, and it's showing pictures of all the different types of cattle and what type of meat they produce. And how this one tastes, how that one tastes, and then somebody was giving us a speech and talking about it, going through the book. And for a moment, for a few moments, it's like I woke up out of the matrix and I'm looking at these cows and I'm hearing what they're saying and I'm reading the words and I'm horrified, horrified. I'm just like, oh my gosh, this is so wrong. Like my spirit was so disturbed. And I mean, imagine if you were sitting there listening to somebody talking about people in this book versus cows. That's how disturbed I was. And I mean, and I'm a person who I really don't eat a lot of red meat, but I do eat chicken and I eat fish and I sometimes eat steak on occasion, rare, rare occasion. But anyway, it was just, again, this waking up, and this has happened to me several times with different topics, where I'm like, oh my gosh, all of a sudden I've woken up and like, this is crazy. So I'm sitting there and my heart starts pounding and I'm just like, oh my gosh, we're looking at these cows talking about how tasty they are. And there was just something really wrong with that in the moment. And maybe it was a part of me remembering what it was like, maybe in a higher realm or a heavenly realm or something. I don't know, but it was so disturbing. And, it took a minute for that to kind of subside. But getting this goes back to a point I've made in other videos where I think living here, again, there is this veil. We talk about it, we know it, we sense it. And the veil is distortion, but it's also a trance. We are living here in a trance-like state. And we have to in order to get through the day. If we weren't in somewhat of a trance, then we would be very disturbed. And I think that's why we use the verbiage waking up, we're waking up, we're waking up. People are awakening. Yes, we're awakening out of the matrix, but we have to do it or, somewhat slowly. I think otherwise we would completely collapse and lose our minds. So, anyway, back to the garden. So, God had originally made us to be vegan, but then there was this fall. And I had an experience one time, and I want to make a whole separate video out of this because it was quite intense. But it was, I had a dream, right? And in the dream, I get off this elevator. I'm in an office building and I'm going to a workshop. And I'm going and I'm signing in. And the person behind the counter, she said, welcome to the fifth dimension. And then she said, look down. And I looked down and my feet were off the ground about this much. I couldn't believe it. I was like, wow. And then the first thing she did after that, she said, here, eat this. And it was a peach. And this happened to me at least 10 years ago, but it was only in the last year or so that I've put these pieces together. I thought she was giving me the peach just to show me how good food tasted there because it was the best thing I'd ever eaten. I couldn't believe it. I was like, wow, this is so good. And she was kind of giggling, laughing at me. And then I got all of my materials. She said, okay, now go stand over by the door and just wait for it to open. And I went to walk, but I was there instantly, like instantly. And I stood there for a moment, a few moments, and then I don't remember. Here's the sad part. I don't remember what I learned inside the classroom. It's veiled from me. I think I have bits and pieces that come back, but it's not like I woke up and was like, oh my gosh, I remember everything. I don't. I remember bits and pieces. But looking back, I think I had to eat that peach to have the code, to have the understanding of what I was going to learn in that realm. So that's why I actually think Eve probably did eat a piece of fruit. Isn't that strange? And I think we have to really take into account, again, technology and how things can be transmitted with frequency. So that food probably held a code and a frequency that, kind of like the movie The Matrix, right? Um, he sits in the chair, Neo sits in the chair, and they said, okay, we're going to download Kung Fu. So you know how to do Kung Fu. And it was a download. And I think that peach for me was a download, if that makes any sense. So the Garden of Eden was hijacked. And so I think what happens is it's very possible that God keeps creating worlds and then they keep getting infected with viruses for any number of reasons. And then there has to be a reset. And do we survive the reset? I think in the past it shows that most people didn't survive the reset. And is it possible now because everybody's feeling something coming? Are we coming up on another giant reset? Well, Klaus Schwab says we are. He wrote a book, I think, called COVID-19 and the Great Reset. So I hear people talking about resetting all the time. And I don't I don't know what that exactly means. And do you remember years ago, there was a whole series, a book series called the Left Behind series, where some people just disappeared because they went to the heavenly realm, the rapture. Uh, is that something like that going to happen? I mean, I don't know. Anything's possible. I say be super ready for it. Um, but, or is it going to be a cataclysm? I don't know. There's a lot of people, this I find interesting. The sun novas every 12,065 years-ish, something like that. And we're kind of due. And if the sun were to nova, we would go into an instant ice age. Well, we'd have like ash, and there'd be floods and an ice age. Most people wouldn't survive that. But one of the things I find so interesting is everywhere I turn now, people are naming their kids and their pets Nova. And why all of a sudden would people be using this name? Um, the only thing I can think of, right, is the Chevy Nova, right? The car from, I think it was the 1970s. And I think my family had one, honestly. But why are we using this name? Everywhere I turn, I'm hearing Nova, Nova, Nova. Is there something in the collective unconscious that we're sort of plugged into? And let me tell you something really interesting. Along those lines, I adopted a dog last year and at the Humane Society. And I had a name that I really wanted to name him, but something kept telling me, no, name him this other name. And so I thought to myself, well, maybe he wants this other name. Maybe this was his name. I don't know. So I went with the name that kept nagging at me, not the one I really wanted to name him. And then I was calling and I made a grooming appointment and they asked for his name and I gave the name and they said, oh gosh, everybody's naming their dog that these days. And I'm like, interesting. I wonder if I'm plugging into some collective programming where, I'm picking it up like a radio wave. Name your dog this, name your kid that, whatever. And I just thought, wow, so fascinating. We are so we're just so easily programmable. We have to remember that. So whether it's about the creation story, whether it's about, anything and everything, what you're seeing on the news lately in the media, and, all of the appeal to emotion that happens, we have to be so diligent and vigilant to stay awake when everything is trying to pull us into a deeper and deeper trance. So, along these lines, I wanted to touch on this. Nobody really ever talks about this Bible passage, John 10:16. Jesus speaking, and other sheep I have, which are not of this fold. Hmm? And he talks about, bringing them all together. Eventually, he wants all his people together. Other sheep I have, which are not of this fold. Well, that could mean any number of things, right? That could mean other cultures, the Hindus, the Asian cultures and religions, the Native American, or it could mean other realms and dimensions, or it could mean, did Jesus come to earth before? Maybe this wasn't the first time. And I know, people just get so worked up, me being a Christian talking about these things, right? Uh, um, some people will call me a heretic for even saying it out loud, but I think we need to ask these types of questions because when we look at other cultures, we do see similar stories, right? Of, someone born of a virgin or, a mother-son dynamic. I think Tammuz was one in the Old Testament. And I don't know, is it possible that Jesus came before? Because if the same story keeps getting told and keeps getting told, it's entirely possible. But I think it really begs the question of, who are we and what are we? And I know in other videos I've talked about being bioelectromagnetic holograms, right? But go deeper than that. Who are we and what are we? What are we doing here? And how many times have we, how many iterations of human have there been? Now we know from archaeology that, there's been all different types of human. Uh, and we know when we think about, and I'm not just talking about, ethnicity, I'm talking about, Homo erectus, Homo sapien, Cro-Magnon man, all of the different iterations, the big skulls. Uh, we have to take a look at the fact that cultures, look at different cultures, different iterations of man. Cultures are something that are grown in a petri dish, right? When you go to the doctor and they think you might have strep throat, what do? They swab your throat and they take a culture, they put it in a petri dish and they see what grows. Well, think about the fact that we use the word culture to describe different ethnicities of people. And, did we, were we hybridized? So in Genesis, further along, it does say that the sons of God, thought that the daughters were fair, daughters of man were fair. And why would they think that? Because we were created in their image, right? And so then it said they created like a hybrid race, like a race of mighty men, demigods, right? And first of all, I believe that they're still walking the planet today, right? Just because there were demigods back then doesn't mean they're not here now. And it says, the sons of God were here. Did they ever go away? What would make you think that they went away? Right? I mean, obviously they had a huge vested interest in humans on Earth. And, movies will tell us it's because they wanted human slaves and they want to harvest our energy or they want to harvest us. I mean, I don't know. But we have to wonder. We have to wonder. Now, it also says in the Bible that there were giants on the earth in those days. And if you look at a lot of the old architecture, right, the doorways were big, a lot of things that were big. Who made the giants? Was it, another DNA experiment? Was it the same God or gods who were making the dinosaurs? I mean, I think this earth has largely been an experimental planet, right? And so they're doing all these experiments, and then things happen, and they go, okay, no, let's just wipe out and start over. And even God, I think early on in the Bible, it says that, man became wicked and he was sad that he created man. Now, are humans destined to always be wicked? I think in some way, shape, or form, because, like I said in other lectures, we are part divine and part animal, right? And so it is our duty, it is our sacred duty to overcome that animal nature and to really try to grow in our divine nature. And I think that's how we jet out of this place. And I've talked about that before. But we have to really look at this from a different lens because it's there. You go to church, you listen to your pastor, he doesn't talk about this. He doesn't talk about it. Now, I'm going to add a caveat to this. Male and female, one half of a whole, right? Why are we creating male and female? Well, there's only ever one reason, and it's to procreate and make more humans. So again, we have to ask ourselves, why? Why? Now, a lot of these interesting, powerful people on the planet right now are talking about depopulation, right? Bill Gates being the biggest leader for that. And why do you think he wants to depopulate the earth? Is it because once we get to a certain number that they do wipe us out and start over? Or maybe something even worse or more nefarious? I don't know, but I think it's something to really pay attention to. Humans were not put here by accident. We're not here by accident. And when you look at how things work here, there's not a piece of this earth that somebody doesn't own. There's not a grain of sand that somebody doesn't own on this earth now. Do you think, I mean, here we are, we're a planet, if you believe that, or at least we're a plane, but we look in the sky, we see other planets, right? And there's galaxies, there's other galaxies. Are we to think that somebody doesn't own those galaxies? Are we to think that somebody doesn't own this planet? Now, we would love to say that it's God, right? We can't because, I mean, ultimately, the ultimate creator owns everything, right? Or has created everything. However, we know that God has given the enemy large dominion here, or he's usurped it. So we don't fully know who's in charge. We know there's a battle. People love to say, well, ultimately it's God, and I certainly hope that's true. I think that's true. But in the here and now, we need to be asking ourselves these questions. Who's in charge? Now, if we know the enemy is in charge of this realm, and has put the distorted matrix on God's creation, then we have to ask, uh, we have to ask where everything is coming from. Everything. The food, the water, the music, the entertainment. We need to know, why is everything becoming synthetic and mimic of what God created? Why? So, I'll give you an example. 2 decades ago, we wore cotton, we wore linen, we wore silk. Now it's polyester, now it's petroleum based. We're wearing fake clothes that smell bad over a period of time. If you ever purchase a pair of jeans that have even a little bit of stretch in them, over time you'll go, ooh, you wash them and you wash them and they smell like a chemical. That's not okay. And these things aren't good for us. Everything is becoming fake. They're making fake eggs in the laboratory now. They're making fake meat. Everything is becoming fake. And that, I think, is how we know that that's the enemy's signature. So, and they're even trying to make people fake, right? Transhumanist movement is, inserting technology and AI into a person. So we look around and everything on this earth now is an abomination of God's creation, right? People are trying to change gender. That's an abomination of God's creation. And I'm not judging because I think people who are struggling with that situation are, they need a lot of help and a lot of prayer. However, we see the stamp, we see whose stamp is on that. I hope this has been helpful. Drop a line in the comments. Let me know what you think. Again, I know this is out of the box to be thinking about these things. Maybe I've watched too many sci-fi movies, huh? But I think we have to really dig into the meanings. And I think Jesus specifically busted into this realm. He came through the matrix. He came into this realm to help us escape, to help us get out of here. And I'm not saying this life doesn't have so much joy to it. And we learn through suffering and we learn through our lessons. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is it's time to bust out for reals. It's time to not get sucked into the prison planet and come back here and come back here. It is time to transcend. And you guys know that I talk about this a lot. I will drop a video talking more about how to do that. And again, the biggest way is to heal those traumas and stop sinning. Sinning meaning stop missing the mark, stop going against God's natural order of things. And when you do that, when you follow God's order of things, that's when you can really experience the miracles and God's supernatural nature. If we're too plugged into the synthetic here of this earth, we're not going to experience that. So again, drop a line if you like this. Please like, share, and subscribe. And check out Church of Christos. We're going to be doing a lot more teachings on this topic and on just how to really wake up out of the dream. This is a dream, folks. Just remember that. This is the trance and the dream, and it's time to wake up. So hug yourselves from me, and I will see you next time.